Silence is a mafia syndicate's loudest alarm. For 60 agonizing days, the heir to the Costello crime family had not uttered a single syllable, locked in a self-imposed psychological hell. Top-tier psychiatrists failed. Violent threats failed. It took a heavily overweight, entirely ordinary woman silently holding his trembling hand to finally shatter the quiet. Arthur Costello paced the length of the heavily fortified Staten Island estate, his expensive Italian leather shoes grinding into the Persian rug. Outside the bulletproof windows, the sky was a bruised, stormy purple. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Sitting in a high-backed leather armchair, utterly motionless, was his 22-year-old nephew Leo. 2 months had passed since the bombing. 2 months since Leo's father, Giovanni Costello, was blown to pieces inside his armored Maybach on 5th Avenue, while Leo watched from a mere 20 feet away. The shockwave had shattered storefronts and ruptured Leo's eardrums, but it was the psychological shrapnel that had left him mute. The boy who was supposed to inherit the most ruthless criminal empire on the East Coast had retreated completely into his own mind. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stopped talking, staring blankly at walls, flinching violently at sudden movements. Arthur had brought in the best specialists money and extortion could procure. Neurologists from Manhattan, trauma therapists from Boston, even an underground interrogator to try and shock the boy back to reality. Nothing worked. The syndicate was growing restless. Weakness in a crime family was blood in the water, and Arthur's underboss, Vincent Rossi, was already circling, making subtle remarks about the need for competent succession. Far away from the ruthless politics of the Costello boardroom, deep within the estate's neglected East Wing, Beatrice Gallagher was dusting a massive shelf of first-edition classics. Beatrice, or B to the few people who bothered to speak to her, was the niece of the estate's head housekeeper, Maria. When Maria noticed the East Wing library falling into severe disrepair, she begged Arthur to let B take the job of cataloguing and restoring it. Arthur, preoccupied with his mute nephew, and a brewing mob war, had waved a dismissive hand and approved it. B was not the type of woman one expected to find in a billionaire mafia boss's mansion. She was a deeply fat woman, carrying over 250 pounds on a modest 5'4" frame. She had thick, soft arms, a wide stomach that pressed against her oversized knitted cardigans, and heavy, solid thighs that chafed when she walked. For most of her life, her weight had made her invisible to the kind of men who ran the world. She was used to being the background character, the punchline, or the ignored bystander. But B was deeply comfortable in her own skin. She knew she was heavy. She knew she took up space, and she found a quiet peace in the fact that her sheer physical mass made her a grounded, unmovable force in a chaotic world. Her heavy footfalls were slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the chaos of the Costello family violently intersected with B's quiet world. Leo had experienced a severe panic attack during a session with a new aggressive psychiatrist who had tried to force him to look at crime scene photos of the bombing. In a sudden, violent burst of adrenaline, Leo had shoved the doctor into a glass coffee table, bolted past the armed guards, and sprinted blindly through the sprawling mansion. His lungs burned, his vision tunneled, and his chest heaved with silent, hyperventilating gasps. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to escape the suffocating pressure of his family's expectations. He burst through the heavy oak doors of the East Wing library and collapsed into a dark corner between 2 towering mahogany bookshelves. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his arms, his entire body vibrating with a silent, violent tremor. He was suffocating on his own muteness, trapped in the memory of the fire and the deafening boom that had taken his father. From atop a rolling ladder, B heard the frantic scramble. She carefully climbed down her weight, making the wooden steps groan in protest. She expected to find a stray cat, or perhaps one of the estate's intimidating guards, seeking a quiet place to smoke. Instead, she found the Mafia prince curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the floorboards. Bea knew who he was, of course. Everyone in the house whispered about the broken air. She also knew that approaching a traumatized, highly dangerous young man was a terrible idea. Yet as she looked at his violently shaking shoulders and his pale, sweat-drenched neck, she didn't see a future crime boss. She saw a terrified boy drowning in open air. Slowly, Bea closed the distance. Her heavy, soft footsteps thudded softly against the hardwood, a rhythmic, deep sound that subtly cut through the high-pitched ringing of Leo's panic. She didn't hover over him. She didn't ask him what was wrong, knowing full well he couldn't answer. Instead, Bea simply lowered herself to the floor. It was a cumbersome process. Her thick thighs and wide hips made sitting on the hard ground uncomfortable, but she managed to settle herself down right next to him. She leaned her broad back against the bookshelf, taking up a significant amount of space, her shoulder merely an inch away from his. She exhaled a long, calming breath, pulled a soft rag from her apron, and simply sat there, radiating warmth. For a long time, the only sounds in the library were the rain lashing against the massive stained glass windows and Leo's jagged, frantic breathing. Slowly, however, the sheer, immovable presence of the heavyweight girl next to him began to act as a gravitational anchor. Her breathing was deep, slow, and loud. Her body heat was like a furnace in the drafty room. She wasn't demanding anything from him. She wasn't studying him with clinical eyes. She was just existing large and solid right beside him. 20 minutes passed. The frantic trembling in Leo's limbs began to subside, downgrading to a dull, exhausted shiver. He slowly lifted his head from his knees, his dark, hollow eyes shifting to the side. He stared at Bea. He took in her round, flushed cheeks, the double chin resting softly against the collar of her worn sweater, and the thick, fleshy hands resting in her lap. She didn't flinch when he looked at her. She just offered a tiny, close-lipped smile and went back to looking straight ahead at the dusty volumes across the room. Leo felt a strange, desperate urge. For 2 months, everyone who had touched him had done so with an agenda. Doctors prodding him, his uncle shaking him by the shoulders, guards manhandling him back to his room. But this woman was a mountain of quiet safety. With a trembling, bruised hand, Leo reached out across the dusty floorboards. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before he tentatively laid his cold, bony fingers over hers. Bea stopped breathing for a moment. His hand was freezing. Without looking down, she turned her palm upward and gently closed her thick, warm fingers around his hand. Her grip was firm, surprisingly strong, and incredibly soft. She gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, grounding him, physically tying him to the present moment through the sheer, undeniable weight of her touch. A tear broke free from the corner of Leo's eye, tracking through the dust on his cheek. His chest heaved, but this time it wasn't a panic attack. It was a dam breaking. He squeezed her heavy hand back, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth, his vocal cords, unused and tight, strained against the mental block that had paralyzed them for 60 days. Vincent, Leo croaked his voice, a harsh, rusted whisper that scraped against the silence of the room. Vincent. Car. Bea's heart slammed against her ribs. She froze, her wide eyes finally darting to his face. She knew the names in this house. Vincent Rossi, the underboss, the man who had been parading around the kitchen like he already owned the estate. Vincent, Bea whispered back, her voice low and soothing, despite the terror spiking in her veins. He changed the cars. Leo rasped, coughing, as the effort tore at his throat. He squeezed her fat hand so hard it almost hurt. My father's driver. Vincent sent him away. Vincent killed him. Before Bea could process the monumental, highly dangerous confession she had just been handed, the heavy oak doors of the library were kicked open with a thunderous crash. 3 armed guards stormed in their assault rifles, raised, followed closely by Arthur Costello and a very pale, very tense Vincent Rossi. "Clear the room," one of the guards barked, sweeping his weapon toward the corners. Arthur's furious eyes locked onto the scene on the floor. His nephew, the heir to the empire, sitting in the dust holding hands with the overweight, plain-looking niece of the housekeeper. "Get away from him," Vincent barked, stepping forward and drawing his sidearm, pointing it directly at Bea's broad chest. "She's got him cornered. Grab her." 2 guards lunged forward to haul Bea up by her arms. She cried out in pain as they gripped her soft flesh, violently dragging her heavy frame upward. "Stop." The word wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a physical blade. Arthur froze. Vincent lowered his gun a fraction of an inch. The guard stood perfectly still. Leo Costello was standing. His legs were shaking, but he was standing on his own. He stepped in front of Bea, placing his frail frame between the armed guards and the terrified heavyweight woman who was currently trying to catch her breath. "Do not touch her," Leo spoke again, his voice gaining a fraction more volume, carrying a dark, lethal authority that sounded exactly like his late father. Arthur's cigar slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor in a shower of sparks. "Leo, you're speaking." "I am," Leo said, his dark eyes locking onto his uncle, but flashing dangerously toward Vincent. He reached behind his back, blindly seeking out Bea. He found her thick wrist and gripped it tightly, pulling her massive, trembling form closer to his back, shielding her. "She stays with me. She doesn't leave my side. Do you understand?" Vincent's face twisted into a mask of fake relief, masking a deep underlying panic. "Leo, thank God. But this woman is a civilian, a servant. She needs to be questioned." "I said she stays," Leo snarled, taking a protective step backward, pushing Bea gently against the bookshelf behind them to secure her flank. He knew exactly what he was doing. If he revealed Vincent's treason right now, surrounded by Vincent's loyal guards, both he and Bea would be dead before they reached the door. He needed time. He needed his uncle alone. And above all, he needed the woman whose heavy, warm hand had just pulled him back from the brink of insanity. Arthur studied the scene, his shrewd eyes calculating every micro-expression in the room. He looked at his nephew alive and fiercely protective, and then at the large, terrified woman cowering behind him. "Lower your weapons," Arthur commanded softly. The guards complied instantly. Arthur stepped forward, ignoring Vincent entirely. "Miss Gallagher, isn't it Maria's girl?" Bea swallowed hard, her double chin trembling. Yes, sir." "It seems you have a calming effect on my nephew," Arthur said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whatever you were making before, I am multiplying it by 10. You no longer dust books. As of this exact second, you belong to Leo. You eat when he eats. You sit where he sits. If he needs his hand held, you hold it." Arthur's eyes darkened, darting to Vincent for a split second before returning to Bea. "And God help anyone in this house who tries to separate you from him. Welcome to the family, Miss Gallagher." Bea looked down at the pale, scarred hand, gripping her thick wrist like a lifeline. She had just become the sole anchor to a traumatized mafia prince, and she was the only other person in the room who knew the underboss was a traitor. The silence had been broken, but the war had just begun. Blood always leaves a stain, but betrayal leaves a crater. For Beatrice Gallagher, the transition from an invisible housekeeper's niece to the most heavily guarded woman in New York happened in the span of a single heartbeat. Arthur Costello did not make empty threats. By nightfall, Bee's modest belongings were moved from the cramped servants' quarters into a lavish, velvet-draped suite directly adjoining Leo's bedroom. Outside her door stood two enormous, heavily armed enforcers. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained intensely fragile. Paranoia clung to the walls of the Costello estate like damp mold. Bee sat on the edge of a plush, king-sized bed, feeling utterly out of place. Her wide, heavy hips sank deeply into the memory foam mattress, her thick legs dangling over the edge. She wore one of her usual oversized knitted cardigans, her soft, round face pale with residual terror. The reality of her situation was terrifyingly clear. She was now a crucial pawn in a mafia succession war. The adjoining door clicked open. Leo walked in. He looked remarkably different from the trembling, pathetic boy she had found on the library floor just hours ago. He had showered his dark hair slicked back, and he wore a crisp-tailored black shirt that accentuated his lean, sharp features. Yet the moment the heavy door clicked shut, the facade crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and a violent tremor returned to his hands. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and collapsed onto the floor at Bee's feet, burying his face into the thick, soft fabric draped over her heavy knees. Bee did not ask questions. She simply let out a slow, deep breath, her large chest expanding, and placed her wide, fleshy hands gently on his back. Her physical weight was her greatest asset. She was a mountain of warmth and stability in a world that was actively trying to tear him apart. "They are watching everything," Leo whispered into the fabric of her skirt, his voice still hoarse, a jagged rasp that sent shivers down her spine. "Vincent has eyes in the kitchen, the garage, even the security detail. Uncle Arthur doesn't know how deep the rot goes." Bee stroked his hair, her stubby fingers moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. "You need to tell your uncle," she replied softly, her voice carrying a deep, resonant calm. "You need to tell him what you told me in the library, about the car, about your father's driver." Leo lifted his head, his dark eyes locked onto her round, comforting face. "I can't just walk into Arthur's office. Vincent intercepts everything. If Vincent realizes my memory of the blast has fully returned, he will kill us both before I finish my sentence. I need an intermediary, someone who operates outside the family hierarchy." A knock on the main door startled them both. Leo instantly scrambled up, assuming a stiff, authoritative posture. Bee composed herself, smoothing down her bulky sweater. "Enter," Leo commanded. The door opened to reveal Arthur Costello, flanked by a short, balding man in a sharp grey pinstripe suit. Bee immediately recognized the man from the news clippings she used to clean up around the estate. It was Murray Richman, the legendary defense attorney known in the underground as the man who could make federal indictments disappear into thin air. His presence meant Arthur was preparing for a legal and structural earthquake. "Leo," Arthur said, his eyes darting to Bee before returning to his nephew. "Murray is here to discuss the transition of your father's assets. We need to formalize your ascension to the head of the board. Vincent is pressing for a proxy vote, claiming you are mentally unfit to sign the documents." Leo's jaw tightened. He looked at Bee, drawing strength from her solid, unmoving presence. She gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. "Uncle Arthur," Leo said, his voice steadying, "I will sign the documents, but I need to amend the bylaws first, and I need Murray to draft a very specific affidavit." Arthur raised an eyebrow. An affidavit regarding what? Leo stepped closer to Bea, resting his hand, casually but firmly, on her thick shoulder. Regarding the day my father died. Vincent didn't just change the security rotation uncle. He paid off the bomb squad in the NYPD. He orchestrated the blast. And I have the bank routing numbers locked in my father's offshore ledger to prove it. A ledger only I know how to access. The silence in the room became absolute. Murray Richmond adjusted his glasses, his face completely unreadable. Arthur's complexion turned an ashen, dangerous shade of grey. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Vincent. Arthur whispered the name, tasting like poison on his tongue. Are you absolutely certain, Leo? I saw him pay the driver to walk away 2 minutes before the detonation, Leo said coldly. I couldn't process it. My brain shut it out. Until today. He squeezed Bea's shoulder, until she pulled me back. Arthur slowly turned his gaze to Bea. The heavy, unassuming woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her large frame completely at odds with the lethal secrets being discussed. Yet Arthur saw exactly what Leo saw, an unbreakable anchor. Murray, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a lethal hushed tone. Draft the papers. I want Vincent's assets frozen by midnight. But we need a distraction. If we move on him too quickly, his loyalists will start shooting, and we will have a bloodbath inside this house. We give him a false sense of victory. Leo suggested, his mind finally operating with the ruthless clarity of a true Costello. We announce a formal family dinner tomorrow night, a celebration of my recovery. Vincent will think it's his perfect opportunity to poison my drink or stage another accident in front of the capos to solidify his claim. What? And while he is distracted with the dinner, Murray chimed in, adjusting his tie. I will have a federal judge quietly sign the asset seizure, citing RICO violations tied to his personal accounts. We cut the head off the snake financially, then physically. The plan was set, but the tension in the estate skyrocketed. The next 24 hours were a master class in psychological warfare. Bea found herself constantly by Leo's side, shadowing him through the grand halls of the estate. Her sheer size made her an imposing physical barrier. When Vincent tried to approach Leo in the dining room that afternoon, offering a sickeningly sweet congratulation on his recovery, Bea deliberately stepped in the way. Vincent stopped, his cold reptilian eyes scanning Bea's wide figure. Excuse me, sweetheart. Vincent sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. The adults are talking. Bea did not shrink. She planted her thick legs firmly on the Persian rug. She felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she remembered the terrified boy crying into her skirt. She drew herself up, her double chin lifting defiantly. Mr. Costello is resting his voice, she said, her tone remarkably steady. If you have a message, you can leave it with me. Vincent's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He leaned in close, the scent of cheap cologne and stale tobacco washing over her. You think because you held his hand, you're untouchable, fatty. You're a human shield, and shields break. Before Bea could respond, Leo's hand shot out, gripping Vincent's wrist with terrifying speed. Touch her or speak to her like that again. Vincent and I will personally feed you to the dogs. Leo whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal promise. Vincent ripped his arm away, feigning a mocking surrender. Just looking out for you, kid. See you at dinner. The grand dining hall was a cavernous room, bathed in the amber glow of crystal chandeliers. A massive mahogany table stretched across the center, set with fine china and polished silver. At the head of the table sat Arthur, his face a mask of composed authority. Down the sides sat the 5 capos of the Costello family, powerful, dangerous men who controlled the city's underbelly. Leo sat to Arthur's right. Beside Leo, in a custom-brought chair, wide enough to accommodate her hips, sat Bea. She wore a simple, elegant, dark blue dress that Maria had hurriedly tailored for her. Her thick arms were bare, and she felt the intense, judgmental stares of the capos burning into her skin. But she kept her back straight, her large presence undeniable in the room of lean, predatory men. Vincent sat directly across from Leo. He raised his crystal glass of red wine, tapping it with a silver spoon to command the room's attention. "Gentlemen," Vincent began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "tonight we celebrate a miracle. Our rightful heir, Leo, has found his voice again. And we have to thank this lovely young woman for playing nurse." He gestured mockingly toward Bea, sparking a few low chuckles from his loyalists down the table. Leo did not smile. He did not touch his glass. He slowly stood up, placing both of his hands flat on the polished mahogany table. The room instantly fell silent. The air grew thick electric with impending violence. "Vincent!" Leo said, his voice ringing out loud, clear and dripping with authority. "You are right. We are celebrating. We are celebrating the exposure of a rat." Vincent's smile vanished. His hand slowly drifted toward the inside of his tailored jacket. The capos shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I remember the street, Vincent." Leo continued, his dark eyes locking on to the underboss. "I remember the smell of the exhaust, and I remember you handing a thick envelope to my father's driver, telling him to walk away from the car 2 minutes before the detonator was triggered." Chaos erupted. 2 of the capos jumped to their feet, shouting in confusion. Arthur slammed his fist on the table. "Sit down!" Arthur roared instantly, silencing the room. Vincent realized the trap had sprung. His eyes darted wildly, calculating his odds. He saw the guards at the door shifting their stances, loyal to Arthur. He had no backup inside the room. With a primal snarl, Vincent abandoned all pretense. He ripped a suppressed pistol from his shoulder holster, bypassing Arthur completely and aiming directly at the center of Leo's chest. Everything moved in excruciating slow motion. Bea saw the glint of the dark metal. She didn't think about the danger. She didn't calculate the physics of a bullet. She only knew that the boy who had cried into her lap was about to die. With a guttural cry, Bea threw her massive 250-pound frame sideways out of her chair. She didn't just step in front of Leo. She completely enveloped him. Her wide body crashed into him, driving them both to the floor just as the pistol coughed a muffled thwip. The bullet tore into the fleshy part of Bea's upper arm, ripping through muscle and fat. The sheer density of her heavy arm slowed the projectile, preventing it from passing clean through to strike Leo behind her. She hit the floor with a heavy, bone-rattling thud, pinning Leo safely beneath her soft, massive weight. Gunfire immediately exploded in the room. Arthur's loyal guards unholstered their weapons and fired. Vincent was struck 3 times in the chest before he could pull the trigger. Again, his body violently thrown backward over his chair, crashing into a pile of shattered crystal and blood. Silence slammed back into the dining hall, interrupted only by the ringing in their ears and the sharp, gasping breaths of the men. "Bea!" Leo screamed, struggling frantically beneath her heavy frame. Bea groaned, her face contorted in pain. She slowly rolled off him, clutching her bleeding arm. Her thick fingers were instantly covered in bright red blood. She looked at Leo, who was completely unharmed, his face pale with terror. I'm okay," Bea gasped, offering him a weak, trembling smile. "It's just my arm. There's plenty of padding there." Leo stared at her, his heart hammering in his throat. He reached out his hands, covered in her blood, and gently cupped her round, pale face. In front of the deadliest men in New York, the Mafia prince leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, uncaring of the mess, uncaring of the stares. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You beautiful, impossible woman. You saved me." Arthur stood over the bloody remains of Vincent Rossi, adjusting his cuffs. He looked down at his nephew and the heavyweight heroine bleeding on his carpet. A profound respect settled over the hardened mob boss's features. Within months, the Costello family stabilized under Leo's new, unshakable reign. He was a ruthless, calculating leader, a true heir to his father's legacy. But he was never alone. Beside him at every meeting, every dinner, and every quiet moment in the library sat Beatrice. She remained a heavy, imposing, and radiant force of nature. She was no longer a housekeeper's niece. She was the immovable queen of the Costello Empire, and the entire underworld knew one absolute truth: you do not cross the woman who holds the boss's hand. If you were captivated by Leo and B's thrilling journey from trauma to triumph, do not forget to hit that like button. Share this intense mafia romance drama with your friends to spread the suspense. Subscribe to our channel for more gripping, real-life inspired stories filled with shocking twists and unexpected heroes. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment and let us know what you want to see next. Your support keeps these incredible stories coming every single week.